let's see here. I have a couple of third-party synths. I have UHE's Ace, which is any cable everywhere. Can be a little tricky. I wanted to see if I could get a decent bass out of it. It took some work, but it's very simple. Like all these bass patches, they don't require crazy gymnastics to pull off. All it takes is a really solid sawtooth waveform that can re-trigger anytime, every time you press it, and a good filter and a good envelope. It's nice to have some distortion or like some overdrive afterwards, but at the end of the day, good waveform, good filter, good envelope. That's really it. And if you apply that knowledge, you can make a good bass line out of pretty much anything. This is something I sampled from Trillion. This is a Juno 106 bass note. One of the wonderful things about Spectrasonics is, yeah, they make these kind of romplers, but they have really, really high quality recordings of things. And I just wanted to record this one to show you guys the capability of using old gear, but actually sampled at better, probably better quality than we could ever sample the gear ourselves. This next bass line, which we're not going to use all of these, but we'll get a chance to choose which one we want to in a little while. This is from a third-party synth. This is Surge. This is my go-to synth for 90% of my sound design. We'll go into some of the concepts, but all the things that I'll be showing you, pretty much you can do with any subtracted synthesizer. You don't need specific, oh, I need this VST to get these sounds. You can do most of these with any. Just some give you a little bit more flexibility or a little more assets or whatever. So each bass note has their own kind of interesting characteristic about it. And I'll show you the Surge bass. Once again, it's very simple. It's just sawtooth going through 24 decibel per octave low pass filter, and it's being modulated by an envelope. In this particular case, this envelope needed to be set a little bit differently than I'd set others, but it gives it a little bite. In the end, what we're wanting, when we want in any bass line, is for the low end of the bass to be able to be felt, and the attack of the note, the pluck, the tone, the bite to be heard. It's a combination of feeling and hearing. So when you put something like this on a amplified sound system with like a big subwoofer, you can feel it, and it'll ripple on some sound systems. You can ripple your clothing. Like, I've become physically nauseous because the bass has been so powerful at certain festivals. It's knocked things loose in my digestive tract, so to speak. The next thing I want to talk about is note length. Whenever you put in a 16th note, for bass specifically, there's some sense that they don't like they're a little loose, or they kind of run into each other. You can set the release as far down as you want, but you start getting that popping thing happening. But it's still kind of running into each other. What do? You can shorten the note lengths. You can shorten the MIDI note lengths themselves to actually correspond with the changes that you want to happen. And if you shorten it using, your ears, we'll do this one. We'll do this. I'll exaggerate. Now, this is having the notes intentionally running into each other. You hear the interference? Now, if you just shorten it, I like using the event list specifically for things like this because it's real easy than trying to like eyeball it. So now you've got a really staccato sounding bass line. Or a really staccato bass line. Another tidbit of information for the Logic users. If people are wondering, what are these numbers here? These are ticks. It's the next subdivision that Logic counts underneath a 16th note. There are 240 ticks in a 16th note. So when we're looking at 120, 120 is exactly 1/2 of 240. So that would equate to a 32nd note. And we can take it down by half again to 60, and that is the length of a 64th note. It might come in handy if you're doing crazy drum programming, or there might be a trick. There's a trick I'll show you to turn any sound into a lead, FM style lead that requires you to use 64th note repetition. But in this particular case, let's say here. Usually for me, a good 20 minutes is spent fiddling around with just that, just to try to get like, oh, it's okay. Which sometimes it might be where I initially set it at, but it's all about the feel. Okay. So now that we've gotten into kick drum and bass, constructing the actual kick drum and bass, we will go into processing in just a little bit. We for this particular example, we tuned our kick to the key that we're working in. Since we're in D, you can, it's not a must. Some people would say it's a must, but it's really about using your ears. If you've got a really good kick that sounds really good at C, and it sounds really harmonious with the bass line right where it is, and you tune it up to be in tune with the bass line and just sounds off, then put it where it works. At the end of the day, it's not, nobody's going to like, oh, your kick drum was a semitone too high. If it works, it works. And with everything that I impart upon you guys, feel free to question, try things a different way. I am no authority. My way is never the only way. It is just a way. And as long as you take the information that you gather as a way to go about things, you can pick and choose what works right for you. Okay, we've talked about volume levels, where I set my kick at 10. I found, like, this is through trial and error of setting my kick at different volumes, and every time I set my kick at like -8, -7, I found myself having to turn things down later on to keep my master from clipping, or to create headroom for the mastering engineer. So I just started, oh, let's just start from the ground up. So I set a pretty relatively rigid level. It's like, okay, that doesn't go above 10, and then everybody else can be slightly nebulous depending on what your ears tell you to do. Trust your ears, but also trust have a backup plan. If your ears fail, have a backup plan. This is a frequency analyzer. I'm using Boxengo Span a lot of the time. It's very handy. So it helps you, like, see things. to a certain degree, and kind of gives you a better idea of where things are at. I find this really handy for certain particular processes. When it comes to the mixing stage, and especially the final mix stage, the frequency analyzer really helps me like see problem areas, or, well, mainly just problem areas. Things that are colliding, frequencies that don't sound right together, or something that just my ears didn't catch. Also, this is another tool that I really like to use. This is from Smart Electronics. This is an oscilloscope called Smexoscope, and I find it to be very, very valuable. I use it to see, basically, like, this helps me look and see what my kick and bass relationship is, how much volume they have on each other, like if one's overpowering the other. Let's see here. See that little spike right there? That's that click. That's that click. You can't hear it, but it's there. It's annoying, but it's you know. And you wouldn't have even known about it until you saw it. All right, let's see here. Let's take this straight D. See, I kind of like that relationship that they have with each other. It's not quite as loud as the kick, but it still presents itself with its own formidable force. So that is the Smexoscope. I will be more than willing to post links where you guys can get all this stuff. This is all free. It's all freeware. Another little tool that I like to use is this is by Destroy Effects as well. It's called an RMS Buddy. I use it to just get what my peak volume level is. Yeah, I can also use that. I can totally also use that, but it just helps at times to find what my peak volume level is and what an RMS. RMS is root mean square, or sometimes can be considered relative mean signal. What I consider it to be is the actual sonic concussive force. It's the actual real pressure of the sound, not quite like SPL, but this is really like how much oomph is this gonna really push the speakers. Whenever I've dealt with mastering engineers, whenever they send stuff back to me, I check it with our RMS meter, just to see how loud things are, usually for my own personal curiosities, and it fluctuates anywhere between like -10 RMS to like -6, but we'll not get into the loudness wars in this conversation, because mastering is far beyond me, even though I do my own stuff. So this is basically tells me kind of how much force I have, and if the full track itself is going to be mastered to like -10, and the kick and bass already are like -15, -16, that seems like a pretty decent amount of power. I'm just like, guesstimating at this point, but this kind of gives me a good impression of how much concussive force this combination is going to put together. The only thing I use RMS for really is just the kick and bass, because I can't really figure out how RMS translates to the other groups just yet. I am also a student like everybody here. We're always students in some way. So we have now covered volume level. Now we're going to go into processing. There is, as you can see on this channel, there's very minimal processing. You don't really have to do too much. If your initial sound is good, you get your envelope setting right, you get it sounding good, you don't really have to put too much extra processing on it. I personally like adding a low cut. Just right below the fundamental or the lowest note, It just clears up any problems between the kick and bass, and also for mixing purposes, you want to always get rid of the frequencies that you don't need because it's going to also eat up your headroom. Stuff that you can't hear but is still in there, it'll eat up your headroom as long as if you don't properly treat it, which we will get to that as well during the mixing stage. So we have now covered let's talk about bass. Now we sampled a bass. There are other things that we did not sample. My personal preference is it really depends on the synth. I sometimes like to change my mind about settings on a synth, especially for a bass patch. So what I would like is to have the synth be flexible. It might be the only thing that I leave actually in the actual instrument would be the bass, if I can get away with it. If I can't, if I absolutely have to sample it, then I have to sample it. But I've found that I might be sometimes a little too hasty with one of my processing decisions, or like, oh, let's just render this EQ cut on there, and it's not quite right. Then I have to go back, if I'm lucky, or rebuild the patch again, and it's never quite where I want it to be. So it's nice to have that, which is, in my projects, the only thing that's usually still in the synth is the bass line by the time we get to the final mixing stage. So you can sample. There's nothing wrong with sampling as long as you bear in mind that when you're using a sampler and you're going to move away from the pitch in which the recording is sampled at, you're going to be introducing some play, so to speak, from whatever the algorithm the sampler has for its pitch calculating, pitch tracking, and it might not always sound right. It might not always sound right. Let's see if I have something that explains that a little bit better. Oh, actually, yes. We'll bring up this Juno. I'll make sure this ESM is turned on. Now it's a C, but watch what happens when I move it up. You hear that? That is because when I sampled it, I set it up to only work for basically C. So that's a error. So the only way that particular sample works now, because I sampled it, is at that particular key. So I couldn't really like do a groovy bass line or anything like that. Now that we've gotten into the mechanics of how to make the sound, and we've talked about some of the notes, let's talk about different grooves. Let's talk about groove. Groove is a combination of kick and bass working together, but you can start the idea of groove with the bass. Let's see. Let's use one that we can have some fun with. We'll just use that fat ESM saw. Now, one of the best ways to play with groove is to play with your perception of dynamics. We're going to actually introduce some dynamics into the bass line by adjusting the velocity on some of the notes. The first trick I'm going to do for this is we're going to take just these outside notes and we're going to adjust their velocity. Now, by lowering the velocity, we have, in a sense, given more importance to these higher notes, to these louder notes. So it gives it a little groove, it gives it a little swing, it's got a little pulse to it. This is one of the bass lines that you would find in some of the Danish-oriented forest music. This is what I would consider one of the Parvati bass lines. Now you can also, you know, you don't have to take the outside notes. You can adjust other notes' velocity as well. If you, let's say you only want the first, if you only want these. Now you've got a gallop going on, but it's a different type of gallop than if you remove the notes altogether. I'm going to mute the notes. So now we've got the traditional gallop, but by introducing that low underpin, and we can even make it a little more obvious and put it about, like, you know, half volume. But it still creates a little bit of force underneath there, so it doesn't feel quite as empty. Let's see. One of my friends, one of the guys that I learned from, Ocelot, one of his particular bass line tricks that I used to watch him do would have a scaling velocity. So it's like kind of stair-stepping up. Like, I'm pretty certain there's quite a few of Aaron's songs that are done in this type of pattern. And let's see, we'll just, oh, can't do that. We'll just type everything. Actually, we might leave that. We'll put that at 90. Why not? That seems like an interesting group. So we'll save that, and we'll write, I'll show you a couple other variations on the Danish forest style of bass line. Now, you can perform it with velocity, but there are some times where you don't really want to sacrifice power. So what we'll do is we'll just write this straight, and this time we're gonna make it all now. Like before, instead of using the velocity, we can actually allow note length to dictate the groove. So once again, I'll take the outside notes, and this time I will make them, I don't know, maybe a 30-second note. Now that's managed to accomplish almost exactly the same thing as the velocity, but now you have that, you still got the little tap. It's still pounding. Let's even make it a little shorter. There we go. I've got a couple of songs where I learned this particular variation in Denmark from one of the guys, Syntax Error to be precise, and it totally blew my mind because it's like I didn't realize that you could use note length to accomplish the same general concept as velocity. It was like, huh? Wow. But it just creates a different feel, and in the end, and all you're looking for is to be able to be flexible about your feel. Well, let's just set this to full. 1, 0. But that actually doesn't sound. See, when it's sampled, it manages to re-trigger properly. So that helps, but you know. I'm not going to cover too much actual music theory in this particular workshop. One, because I have to look things up to figure out if things are in key, and secondly, because everybody can approach music theory from their own way. In this particular case, since this key is in, this is D, I think we're going to be a little weird, and we're going to use a mode. We're going to use D Dorian. Now, for anybody freaking out, what's D Dorian? Don't worry. Everybody knows the C major scale in here, right? Everybody knows, like, no black keys, right? D Dorian is the C major scale, just starting with D. So you can sound like, oh, I'm doing this incredible musical mode. I'm doing D Dorian. But in all honesty, I'm just too lazy to actually deal with sharps and flats. So I'll just write in the C major scale, but start it in D, which is completely legal. All right, so now that we have covered kick drum and bass lines, there's minimal processing on this particular one, just really because it's already pretty good as it is. I find the more plugins you stack on top of things, you tend to lose the sound a little bit sometimes, and it's better to start with a really good, clear idea and then use things to accentuate it rather than to just like stack in a whole bunch of stuff and to make it like fat and loud. I'd rather it be clean, clear, and fat and loud. But, you know, you can do both. You just can't sacrifice one for the other. Let's talk about compression. Let's talk about, do we need compression? We'll switch over to Ableton in just a second. How many of you guys here are relatively familiar with what a compressor is or how compression works? Ah, cool. Controlling the dynamics of each sound is critical to achieving a really good sounding mix. Now, achieving controlling dynamics can be done in a multitude of ways. You can use dynamics processors, such as a compressor, to if something's getting a little unruly, smack it back down. Or you can set things up to where you rarely need, if you need compression, you need very little compression. This can be accomplished for starters by working in a reasonable volume and not really over smashing things, and also being mindful about the sounds that you're running through the compression. We'll talk about this in a little bit more once we get more sounds going. Next thing I want to do is we'll talk about some drums. We'll get into some actual synthesis aspects of things. What I like to do for drums is I do use some samples. I definitely use some samples, but I also do like to make my own stuff to go along with things. And the two easiest drums to make that anybody can make is a closed hi-hat and a snare. And I will show you how to do that. We'll use Ultrabeat for this, and then we'll also transfer over to Ableton, where we will pick up from there, and we'll also do snare production in there as well. So what I will do, just to make things easier, is to just make a blank Ultrabeat. Now, we'll start with the closed hi-hat first. Whenever we listen to a closed hi-hat, we listen for the high frequency capabilities that it has. And we can never, have you ever listened to a closed hi-hat? I don't think anybody can ever pick out the actual pitch of the hi-hat most of the time. You can just tell it's kind of noisy and very articulate. It's got a tap to it. Well, because of that characteristic, we can use that to our advantage when we're designing this closed hi-hat. For the sake of ease, we're going to turn things down a significant amount. And we're going to start the sequencer for Ultrabeat. And to be lazy, we're just going to have a very static pattern to start with. We're going to turn on the noise oscillator. And then we're going to change to a high-pass filter and kind of see where we're at. We want to get rid of a lot of stuff, but it's kind of hard for us to figure out what's going on here until we shape the transient on this. So now I'm going to set the volume of this noise oscillator to be modulated by... Actually, no, we're not going to do that. We're going to set the actual output of the voice itself. And we're going to set the envelope for. And we're going to turn off the sustain. And I'm going to keep dragging this volume envelope. I get something short, maybe about 50 milliseconds or so. Sounded a little washy, but we can shape that just like we did for the kick drum. I'll turn this up just a hair. Oh, I can turn up more than hair. That's like very quiet. So now we're basically shortening the decay. Well, now I'm lengthening it, just trying to dial it in. That seems nice and generally tappy. All from some white noise, properly envelope shaped. And, you know, as things go along, you can adjust the envelope. And so that's the closed hi-hat. Like I said, this is one of the two easiest drums you can make. So now we're going to take the same concept and we're going to investigate into a snare. Now, a snare is just a hair trickier because it's got a couple of elements that happen to it. When you're listening to a snare, you get like the body or the punch, the tonality of the snare, but then there's also like this sizzle, this snap. This basically the thwack that comes through on top of the tone. So if we look at this as two separate things happening, and subsequently treat this sound creation process as such, we can get what we want. Now, what we'll do for this is use two separate oscillators. We will use the noise oscillator again, but instead we'll use the bandpass filter. I'll just program in some simple snare pattern, like very simple, you know, and we'll already be able to get a good feel for what's going on by, I'll mute that. So you can already feel that it's like, okay, that's interesting. It's got some possibilities there. I'm gonna shape the envelope on that for a second. Now let's see. I think in this particular case, I will shape the cutoff to rise up just a hair. If I can get the timing right. Set to relatively short time, short decay, because what we're aiming to do here is accentuate the snap by making the cutoff frequency of the bandpass filter rise up just a hair. Okay. Resonance is optional. Sometimes it helps, sometimes not. So now we're getting some of the smack. Getting some of the smack, but that's only half of the equation. The second half of the equation comes from that low end. Now what? Now obviously that's way too much. We just want just enough to not really, just enough so you can kind of know it's there, but not to where it's going to overpower, because it's a low pitch and it's a sine wave. So it could possibly interfere with your kick. Maybe I'll tune this up. And we'll adjust the volume envelope on this one as well. We'll make it volume enveloped. Now that's nice and snappy. Let's see here. The bandpass is really what makes it all work, because otherwise you got this. Coincidentally, you could probably use the bandpass to make a clap. Just all about the right settings on the envelope. Okay. And there you have it. Easy drums. Those are the two easier ones to make. And so those are the two things that I generally do end up making for all of my pieces. Or at least the close hats, because it's just really easy to make the basic sound. Now, let's look into how to make it interesting. We were talking about groove before. Groove also happens where in relationship to the drums as well as the bass. So let's, we'll just give it a little gallop. Oh, that's a lot of gallop, but whatever. Okay, now we'll label this close hi-hat, label this snare. Now, this is okay, but it's very mechanical. We can apply some of the same tricks that we used on the bass line to make it seem less mechanical on the hats as well. So what I'm going to do is this case, I'll just randomize the velocity. And as soon as you play with the velocity, it already starts playing with the feel just by alternating how hard something's going to get hit. Another good way to increase the groove is to play with the swing. Now, what swing is it basically when you're on a meter, when you're following like a metronome on the meter, and you're counting counting 1 through 4. Once you get down to the subdivisions like the semiquaver or the 16th note, there's some room for play for the weak beats or the what would be considered the second and fourth of the 16th notes. A really good way to explain this, to illustrate this, would be for me to drag out this pattern right here, and I'll show you within Logic because they have a little swing thing. They have quantize adjustments where you can give different feels of swing. So now I've taken this ultra beat pattern, pretty simplistic. Right here, there's all these types of swing. See how it's altered the timing on, notice just the second and fourth note in a bar or in a beat. The downbeat and I guess what we consider the upbeat are still held in perfect time because this is what you need to keep time, to keep it from this is what drummers use to keep time is the closed hi-hat, closed and open hi-hat. So you have to keep something rigid, but it gives it a little bit of play. Now let's turn it off. Oh, wait. We'll make it straight 16th again. Now we'll once again give it another feel of swing. I think I usually like 16C. And because swing only affects these particular locations of the notes, you can actually have your snare quantize the swing if you wanted to, and it only would be so now it's got a little funky thing going on with it. So that's one way to create groove, is by alternating, or not alternating, but altering the velocity of the notes that are being played. And this actually comes in very handy in regards to snare programming to alter the velocity, because you can start doing something that's referred to in the drumming world as ghost notes, where it's these, half volume, quarter volume, maybe 3/4 volume, these little lower velocity, lower power notes that kind of help add the flavor to the rhythm. So I'm going to draw a few of these little thingies in. Let's see that. last little fun thing about Logic I'll show you guys for the Logic users is the transform window. This allows you to, especially within regards to MIDI, allows you to basically transform MIDI in a multitude of ways. So what we're gonna do is I'm gonna select a few of these green guys right here, and I'm going to go to Function, Transform, and in this case, it has a really nice little preset for me called Random Velocity. We'll use that. Now it brings you to the transform window where it takes its reading node in, and it takes the velocity straight through and it randomizes it between the values of 40 and 127. I don't really want it to be 127 because that's where the full power snares are, and the ghost notes need to be like somewhat less than that. So I'm gonna say maybe like something like that. And we will, now that they've been selected, I'm just gonna operate. And you can see that they're changing every time I do it. This transform window and the transform function in the Logic environment are incredibly powerful. Incredibly powerful. You can do ridiculous stuff in the environment and with this transform object, which I hope to get to as well. All right, so now we've got these lower velocity notes going on, right? So now it's got a sense of roll to it. All right. Last thing about drums before we go over to Ableton, now that we've done snares. Okay, you want to layer on some loops. I've taken the liberty of taking some loops very, very raw. I have not done any processing to them yet because I'm going to process this with you, or at least get it to a point where it's usable. And we're going to do this together. There's nothing on here. I'm going to turn down the volume because it's undoubtedly loud. Now, if we listen, you hear all that stuff? Yeah, that's got some low end in there. First thing we're going to do is we're going to clear all that low end right out because we don't need it. It's just eating headroom. In fact, we could probably be really drastic if we wanted to. Now, I wouldn't necessarily always cut this high, but in this particular case, it doesn't necessarily sound too bad. Now let's layer back in our other drums, which our snare is way too loud, and we'll fix that right away. That's probably doable for now. I usually like to keep my hi-hats at a very, very low volume because they're, they can also be, hi-hats can be kind of annoying at certain points, especially if they're too loud in the mix. It's like listening to a clock happening. You don't really want to hear the timepiece unless it's like surging the movement forward. So I like to keep them a little bit further back in the mix than maybe other people do, or just that usually is one of the more the quietest element in my percussion mix. Always my closed hi-hats, just because for me, I hear the closed hi-hat, drives me crazy. So I mix them quieter subsequently. Now we could just call it a day and be done with this particular drum if we wanted to, but I like doing more than just taking something stock, putting some EQ on it. Let's play with the timing a little bit. in Logic's Inspector, you can shift when something happens. So I'm going to delay it negative 1/16 note. So I'm just going to move it ahead by a 16th note. Now, it's like, wow, that groove's kind of off now, right? But it seems to kind of incorporate itself into the greater groove. We can even move this over by an 8th note. So now you basically have two breakbeats going on top of each other, but they're happening, the snares are happening at different times, so they're not colliding. And the secondary snares from this other breakbeat just add an extra element of rhythmic capability behind it. It's basically layering, but almost a lazy way of layering, because I am layering a whole entire drum loop. But let's say, okay, it's like, all right, Greg, yeah, that's cool and all that, but like, we want something more interesting done. Let's mangle it. Let's put some effects on here. So I will use the third-party effects for this particular one. Audio Damage Replicant is a very fun thing. Basically, it's a very interesting take on the delay. Basically, it has this little sequencer thing here, and then each step corresponds to either telling it to delay whatever comes in by the length in which it's given here in this menu here, and how many times to repeat, which you can repeat it up to like 15 times or not repeat it at all. I'm going to not repeat it at all, and I'm going to take a small amount of this, and we're going to use it just to capture just what comes out processed by this thing. Let's see what happens. Now, we've basically, by using some elements of randomization as well as telling it to happen, once it gets to here, to kind of to play if it wants to. We've introduced now a playful groove. Not going to be static all the time.
Very much like to thank Pyramind for hosting me here once again. I think this institution is really cool, and until I came here for the first time, I had never seen anything like it in my whole life.
What I think really separates us from other people who teach is that we are outrageously passionate about what we do, and especially in electronic music.
Since coming to Pyramind, I've discovered electronic music, and San Francisco being a mecca for underground electronic music opened up so many doors for me and kind of blew my mind.
We cover everything from absinthe to contact. When people get to the mind-melting level, we get into modular synthesis.
Everything about native instruments, everything about Logic synths down to the finest detail. We learned it all.
The fundamentals of understanding how things work, that's just essential. But then beyond that, there's so much more, and that's where it gets into just a lot of the artistic side of like the creative approach of why you do something, not just how.
There's a lot of schools that just, they focus on the technicality of recording music, but I wanted something that would foster creativity and really help me develop as an artist as well.
Each of our genre-specific programs comes in 4 levels. There's a basic, an advanced, a professional, and then a master's level. And the master's level is, of course, everything we do. It's the largest and most powerful programs that we can create for you.